Hello, and thank you for joining us for what's new in the next generation of Rhode Island science standards. My name is Francis Vigent. I'm CEO here at NOADM. My background is as a teacher, a classroom teacher at the elementary, middle school level as a STEM specialist, as well as a high school math teacher. Part of my passion for STEM and for science really comes from making math something that's hands-on, something that's applied, but also something that can be used to solve problems or answer questions. And I think that brings us to the big question of why STEM? And here at NOADM, we really believe that when you look at something like STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math, only 4% of students will go on to hold a STEM degree. So it begs the question why every student should actually go about learning STEM. And we believe that STEM is the best avenue for students to learn higher order thinking skills. And those are the creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills that will support them as problem solvers and in the pursuit of answering questions in a technical sense, regardless of any career or college that they choose. Whether or not they get a science degree, the reality is that those 4% of degree holders that invent new technologies employ a disproportionate number of the other 96%. So whether that student goes on to be a salesperson, a marketing person, a manufacturing analyst, one way or another, having those skills to be able to create, evaluate, and think analytically, especially with any kind of background in science itself and the content, will help them be more trainable and also more desirable by employers. So it's a way of creating opportunity. The way we kind of go about that is to put students in the role of scientist and engineer, to really challenge them to not only develop those skills, but to be able to engage in the content, interact with it, and then actually extend it. And so NOADM's role is really making that possible in the classroom through curriculum materials and professional development. So that's where we sort of fit into this bigger picture. That's enough about us. Our goals for today are to, let's see here, pull up. To take a look at what makes the new next generation science standards tougher. Next, we'll take a look at how the new standards link to Common Core ELA and math, and how the next generation science standards will shape methods for science instruction K through 12, and really pre-K through 12, and sort of wind up with how science and engineering practices under NGSS integrate with art. We're going to try and take a classroom level look at this. So as we look at each of these questions, we're going to be thinking about what does that look like in the classroom? How's that actually changing the sort of classroom environment? Rhode Island's particularly unique. RIDE was the first to adopt the next generation science standards back in 2013, but they were also have sort of taken the longest timeline for implementation. Most states have taken 3 or 4 years. Rhode Island took 5. So Rhode Island anticipates full implementation September 2017. So there's another year or two out there. And that begs the question, what should be happening now? And participating in these kinds of webinars, collecting materials, and actually piloting and testing things in the classroom is something to think about as you're aligning or developing your own curriculum. 2017 won't just be an implementation year or full implementation for Rhode Island, but it will be a point in time when we have the next generation science assessments. We're expecting in the next 24 months to be seeing what the next generation standardized assessments look like, and we're expecting those to look something like a cross between the inquiry portion of NECAP and the OECD's PISA assessment, if you're familiar with that international assessment of science skills. One way or another, the movement here is towards the development of skills, using those skills to access content, and students demonstrating that knowledge as they are able to work with content and actually extend it in context. So without further ado, let's jump into what makes these new next generation science standards tougher. And it starts with something we like to think of as the STEM cycle. So the next generation science standards aren't really something new, at least not that new, even as new as 2013. They have roots that go all the way back to 2008 and even beyond. There was a realization that happened at a national level among the National Academies of Science and Engineering that our classrooms were not preparing students with the skills they need to participate in the STEM workforce. And so there was this sort of gap between available jobs and trainable employees to take those jobs. And at looking sort of further into the way students are prepared from pre-K on up, it became sort of evident that classrooms were not really teaching science or engineering skills. They're teaching about science and engineering at best. And so there were these early publications that started to take a look at really what is science, what is engineering, what are those skills, and how do they complement each other. And so in Rhode Island we have sort of the inquiry silo, so those sort of inquiry standards out there in the unifying concepts. But what's happening now with the next generation science standards is that science and engineering have a very specific definition. Technology, knowledge, math play very specific roles. And what you end up with is this kind of STEM cycle. So what is science? Science is knowledge from experimentation. Scientists answer questions using experiments. So if you think about a scientist asking a question, they pose a hypothesis, they test that hypothesis with an experiment. That experiment yields data that they can use to reflect on that hypothesis, whether it was true, false, inconclusive, or supported or not supported. And that yields new knowledge, scientific knowledge. It's knowledge from experimentation. Engineers solve problems. So engineers take that scientific knowledge, they see a problem that can be solved, and they start to look at the available resources. They consider possible solutions. They pick one. They prototype it. They then test that prototype. So a prototype is just a scaled down model. It's sort of the first of its kind. It's tested, and that test yields data. The data then allows the engineer to reflect back on the prototype to decide whether it should be refined or replicated. Does it solve the problem? And so those prototypes, when they do solve the problems, are technology. Technology solves problems. And in education, oftentimes we're guilty of really referring to technology inappropriately. Technology is not only things that are electronic. Technology is doorstops, desks, tables, glass, bottles. These things are all technology. They solve problems. Human needs, and humans design technology to solve needs for nature, prevent flooding, preserve species. So that technology makes the cycle go full circle when it allows scientists to either answer questions that they couldn't answer before because the technology didn't exist, or to ask new and deeper questions. So you might think about scientists right now asking questions about Pluto or answering questions about Pluto because prior till now there has not been probes with able to collect the amount of information. There hasn't been technology able to access information about Pluto the way that probes are doing right now. And so engineers designed that technology, they prototyped it, they scaled it, they sent it into space, and now that technology is enabling scientists to essentially collect or develop more knowledge. So it begs the question, what is math? What's the role of math? Well, math is the means by which we can quantify our observations, first of all. So measuring, capturing data. Data is quantitative. There's qualitative data, which are things like yellowish, greenish, bluish, bubbly, bigger, smaller. Quantitative data is data that is very specific, 2 centimeters greater than, an average of 15 milliliters. It's something that's very, very specific. And so the role of math in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, is to, first of all, be able to capture specific observations. Second of all, to be able to analyze and evaluate those observations in a way that's very clear. So if you think about doing 3 trials or 30 trials of something, to be able to then analyze, maybe take an average. So if you were testing the growth rate of plants, one that receives treatment with Miracle-Gro and one that does not, being able to test that on multiple plants, measure the height difference, average that, and look for a difference in the averages, and then communicate that back and use that communication as a piece of key evidence to support the claim about the hypothesis of whether Miracle-Gro or some other plant food actually increases the height of plants. So this is not only a sort of a STEM cycle, it's a cycle of innovation, because as engineers are developing technology, scientists are developing scientific knowledge, which is enabling engineers to develop more technology, and math is playing that role of helping everyone communicate. Very, very important. And the faster this can happen, the faster society can essentially develop or evolve in the sense of STEM. Think of cave person scientist, just as an example here, may ask the question, what happens when clay is placed in the fire? They may have the hypothesis that the clay doesn't come apart anymore. Somehow it changes. So they would test that, place the clay in the fire, gather data, and let's say the measurements and tests, and they come back to find out that indeed their hypothesis is true. It's supported by the data that clay no longer comes apart after being fired. Sort of the cave person engineer would take that knowledge and say, you know, we could solve the problem of carrying or storing water by taking that clay and forming it into vessels or jars of some type. So they would create a prototype, they would fill it with water, they would test it under those kind of conditions, gather data, and if they indeed find out that it solves the problem of being able to store water in these sort of clay jars, then now we have a new technology. So that may be a bit more concrete way of looking at this. In the classroom, the way this makes a difference is that students, teachers, and administrators should all be on the same page with the National Research Council and this definition of science, engineering, technology, and math, but they should really be self-aware in terms of the role that they're playing at any given time. And that's picturing it from the student's perspective. A student should know whether they're engaging in science or engineering. Are they answering a question and going to use develop an experiment to be able to do that? Are they solving a problem and developing a prototype to be able to do that? And so by being aware of that and by transferring that role over to the student, we really get everybody on the same page right from the get-go, because this is the foundation of all the standards and all of the really learning experiences that should be generated as a result of the learning expectations. So let's take a look at those right now. So this is a screenshot from the Next Generation Science Standards. Next Generation Science Standards are performance expectations. This is one of the areas where, and really from the get-go, it really begins to depart from the GSEs that you're used to in Rhode Island. So when you think about those unifying themes like scientific inquiry, nature of science, system and energy, patterns of change, and so on, they're kind of siloed. Even though they're intended to sort of be infused throughout, these new standards are not asking students to identify or to distinguish between, and sort of leaving inquiry as kind of an add-on to that. What these new standards are doing is they are requiring students to be able to demonstrate skills, knowledge of concepts, and an understanding of how those concepts interact in context. And so the best example you'll have of this is really that inquiry portion of a kneecap. That is really the closest thing to sort of a next generation application that you would have seen in standardized testing at least, and in expectations of students. So when we look at the standard, students who demonstrate understanding will be able to develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. So imagine that inquiry portion of a NECAP assessment. This is what a student would be required to demonstrate to show that they're proficient in this standard. The context that would be created would rely on these three dimensions that you see below. So it's kind of like a three-legged stool where the performance expectation, which is in the white area, is the sort of seat of the stool, and the three legs are the dimensions. So science and engineering practices are a more scientific approach to the unifying themes of scientific inquiry, and patterns of change is more like cross-cutting concepts, but for right now, the easiest way to think of it is it's a more scientific approach to inquiry. The practices are skills specific to the discipline, and we're going to take a look at what those are in a moment. Disciplinary core ideas are those content domains. So think of life science as being sort of a disciplinary core idea. The thing is that the disciplinary core ideas no longer contain standards like, or the elements like be able to identify a sedimentary, igneous, or metamorphic rock. Disciplinary core ideas now focus on the content that has relationships. So when you look at this example, LS2.A, the food of almost any kind of animal can be traced back to plants. So there's right there, just in the first sentence, we're already talking about a system. It's a food chain and food web concept. And so when you look at matter, matter's transferred through systems, and energy is also transferred through systems. So it's no longer adequate to be able to identify something. A student needs to be able to understand the relationship between the parts, and so how that concept relates to itself and to other concepts as well. Cross-cutting concepts in this green box, that's the third dimension. Those are a more scientific approach to the unifying themes of patterns of change, form and function, systems and energy. Cross-cutting concepts are really looking at how the content behaves. So when we think about the disciplinary core idea, that first sentence we just talked about, you can see that the cross-cutting concept that relates is that a system can be described in terms of its components and their interactions. So when you think about food, you can trace it back in terms of the components of the system, sort of the different animals or organisms in the food chain or in the food web that transferred energy and matter from the plant all the way to the animal at the end of that food chain. So the system behavior, essentially. So the future of the classroom is a place where these three dimensions, so the practices, which are the skills to be able to access the content, are being practiced in the context of the content, which is the disciplinary core ideas, with an awareness of these cross-cutting concepts in such a way that the student is demonstrating their understanding. And so, when you think, where does that understanding come from? It comes from interacting with the content using those practices. So it's kind of a very different model, but in some ways it's easier to understand, but you need to really understand that these three dimensions are forming that context, and that standard is no longer sort of a checkbox, multiple choice style question, but rather something that a student is going to be expected to be able to demonstrate in any context that's related. The STEM practices are basically, at a high level, there are 8 of them, and you have to think of them from the student's perspective. So as a result of instruction, a student should be able to engage in these STEM practices in that context. So they should be able to ask questions in a scientific context. Remember that that cycle we talked about. So they should be able to ask questions as scientists. They should be able to define problems as engineers. Number two, not only should they be able to use a model, but they should be able to develop that model. So a model is something, in a very basic sense, a means of representing a concept. So a student shouldn't only be able to use the representation of a concept like a food chain or food web, but they should actually be able to develop it to show connections between concepts, for instance. Number three, not only carrying out an investigation, but actually planning it. And so planning an investigation is where we start to see not only practices, but processes come in. Investigations are planned using either the scientific method, or we would call it the scientific process, or the engineering design process. And that depends on whether we're dealing with the context of science in terms of a question or engineering in terms of a problem. Using mathematics and computational thinking. So a student needs to be able to use math to quantify and analyze what they're doing, but also to think about the data in light of their experiment. Does it make sense? When you take that data and you compare it to data collected by peers, as a student, are you able to see yourself as an outlier, or to see yourself within sort of the min and max boundaries? Does it make sense? Can you look at your data and identify sources of human error or errors in procedures? Constructing explanations in science and also in engineering, designing solutions within an engineering context. This is where we start to get into evidence-based writing. So the plans that students are creating now with next generation science standards using the STEM practice skills in the context of the scientific process or the engineering design process means that students are going to come up with data that they then use to explain their findings or their solution. The reason it's evidence-based is it's taking the evidence from the data and it's using it to support a claim about their hypothesis or about their prototype. So it's very important. It's something that we think about evidence-based writing in terms of ELA, but especially with Common Core. And there are Common Core technical standards, which we'll look at in a second, which closely relate. But it's important to kind of think about this within science in terms of the scientific or engineering process. Engaging in argument from evidence is essentially where students then take that claim that they've made, the evidence they've used to support it, and they turn that around and share it with peers. Because in a real next generation environment, students are working independently, maybe in small groups of two, but they're working independently so that all of these little groups where students are being scientists and engineers are actually coming up with things that are going to be different. And when you bring classrooms back together so that students can debrief and bring those conclusions up, share them with their peers, they can begin to look for those variations and ask why. Why are there variations? Is this an outlier? Is this a different approach? Is this human error? Is it persuasive? And so engaging in argument from evidence is a STEM practice for that reason. It's fundamental. And then finally, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information, which is sort of infused in many ways throughout all of these, but you can see that it's so important to specific STEM practice. So what does that look like in the classroom? Well, it looks just like what you see on your screen here. Students in those small teams, in this case these are two 4th or 5th graders who are in the role of engineer. They've gone through their nonfiction reading, they've had a Socratic dialogue in their classroom, and now what they're doing is they're using those STEM practice skills to work through the engineering design process, and they've been charged with a problem that they need to solve. So they're taking that problem apart, they're looking at their available resources, and as partners they need to decide on potential solutions and pick one so that they can prototype it. And once they develop that prototype plan, scientific drawing, they're going to build it, they're going to test it, they're going to gather that data, and then they're going to reflect back on their design and maybe decide to improve it. They may need to refine. So that's what's going on here. And you can see a little bit in the background. I mean, these two students are engaged together as pairs, but around the room, this is going on in pairs all over the place. The skills that are being developed as a result of that sort of small team environment, moving from sort of the nonfiction reading, Socratic dialogue, to these independent teams where they're actually developing a nonfiction text. So when you see they're using these lab notebooks, those lab notebooks are blank composition books where they're really developing a nonfiction text, because that's what the result of using the scientific process or the engineering design process is. It's a scientific or engineering nonfiction text, which is original to those students and to their ideas, and that's very important. In that process, and we've sort of already talked about this a little bit, they're engaging Common Core technical ELA standards. They're engaging the Common Core math practices. The nonfiction reading, and the way that we've designed curriculum, that nonfiction reading helps bring those three dimensions to life. It sets that nonfiction context for the problem or question that the students are released with responsibility to investigate and solve as scientists or engineers. So you're addressing a lot of nonfiction reading standards with science in that context, and then also writing. In terms of math, the students are really living out a word problem at this point. They are bringing their own ideas to life, they're gathering the data, they're then analyzing the data, and they're using that data to support a claim. And as scientists and engineers, things do not always go as planned, especially as kids. As we think about these questions or problems, it's an issue of, you know, did I actually think about that? Is this the result of something I didn't think about? And so that analysis and that evidence is really key in connecting math with ELA and science here. The only thing that's really truly science only is the experimenting or prototyping itself, hands-on. And what's great is that by bringing the next generation science standards to life in the classroom and charging the students to really releasing the responsibility to them to be scientists or engineers, they're developing those higher order thinking skills that we started this whole session talking about, those creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills. And they're doing it in multiple content domains at the same time. And you could add in here social studies, you could overlap art. There's many different areas you could overlay here, but just in the core areas we often talk about, ELA, math, and science. Even in a Common Core world, it is really coming to light with these new standards. And it's really a help, I think, to teachers because it gives them really the freedom to be able to engage students at this level. Teachers are no longer sort of the sage on the stage having to regulate every student's movement. It's about setting the students up with nonfiction backgrounds so that they have a common background, having a meaningful dialogue with them where that nonfiction background is really being linked to the community, being linked to the students' experiences, and the students are engaging in that because they're engaging in the thinking and bringing their ideas forward. And then it's really releasing that responsibility to take the practices and take the content and move it further, interact with it, try to solve a problem or allow the students to solve a problem with their ideas. Really, really key. What you see on your screen now is a reorganization of Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is traditionally it's modified 6 levels: remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. What's a big shift from those GSEs that we're used to in Rhode Island to these next generation science standards is that these are not siloed. It's not that, you know, sometimes inquiry gets matched with something, not sometimes that a particular unifying theme applies. It's that it's all integrated, it's infused, because students need to be able to demonstrate their understanding. That's the meaning of a performance expectation. So in order to demonstrate understanding, those STEM practices require students to be able to create, evaluate, and analyze simultaneously. And that's why you see this rearranged where create, evaluate, and analyze are on the same level. Remembering, understanding, and applying is necessary, but it's insufficient. And so the old form of standards where you would see words used like identify or distinguish between really are low-level sort of thinking skills, but really low-level, a lower-level approach. The new standards really are requiring students to create. So when you see words like develop, that's what we're talking about. It's creating. When we're talking about gathering evidence and then using that evidence to form a conclusion, that is analyzing and evaluating and also applying sort of simultaneously. So it's a really important piece to keep in mind, that this idea of inquiry has been transformed under the new standards, and that create, evaluate, analyze is something a student needs to be able to do independently and simultaneously in that context. And that's why I come back to the kneecap and say that if you think about those inquiry portions as a place where students are asked to do that, if you had to sort of look at it and say, well, I wonder how our performance would be sort of on next generation science assessments when they do emerge, I would urge you to take a look at your performance under the inquiry portion of the kneecap, because that's really where those assessments are going, because those are the skills that are required. Taking a look at the connection between the sort of STEM practices and that higher order thinking and these other content domains like ELA and math specifically, it's important to sort of take a look at the standards themselves from a Common Core perspective, so from the perspective of an ELA teacher or from a math teacher. So I pulled out a few from the middle school level just to point out to you here. So you can see what we previously talked about were the science and engineering practices. So those come from NGSS. What you see here are the ELA technical subject standards. So those are coming from Common Core ELA. The first one, using evidence to support analysis of science and technical texts. That is an ELA Common Core standard. So you can see how that would fit into this environment and into the context of those scientific practices, or the the scientific process or the engineering design process. Providing an accurate summary of text distinct from prior knowledge or opinion. Determining the central idea or the conclusion of a text. So that's something that's going on in Socratic dialogue. It's something that's going on in the partners as they're planning their investigation, those partner teams, that small group learning that's going on. It's also something that's happening as students are forming conclusions, because they're entering with an opinion. They're putting that opinion forward in the form of a hypothesis or in the form of a prototype. Then they're testing it. And then they're summarizing sort of their findings, but really reflecting on it critically and making a claim to see if their findings were at all different than what they had expected, and using the data to support that. So it's pulling from the experiment, but also from the text, because there's a factual basis to this that sort of emanates from that nonfiction context. This one shocks people a lot of times. Following precisely a multi-step procedure is actually an ELA standard and not a science standard. So if you're an administrator and you're walking into a classroom and students are receiving a procedure from the teacher and then following that procedure, they're not doing science. They're not actually engaging in the practices. They are engaging in ELA, just in science class. And that's valuable, but it's valuable for ELA. It's not valuable for teaching science. And this is one of the places where I think a lot of things sort of, there's the fork in the road. As the National Research Council was looking at what we teach historically in the science classroom, pre-K through 12, a lot of it is sort of paint by number, see and do. And that is not the goal of the next generation science standards. It's not to show something and have students regurgitate it. It's not to just test their understanding. Do you remember the definition to the rock cycle? It's to actually engage the students in those practices. And so following a procedure is inadequate. You need to be able to develop that procedure, develop that plan as a student. Another one, information expressed visually. So this is graphs, tables, infographics, flow charts, diagrams, pie charts, line graphs, so on. Those, when you're doing that in science, you're actually addressing ELA technical subject standards, and you're also addressing math standards as well, but this is an area of large overlap. And then, of course, distinguishing among facts, reasoned judgment based on research and speculation. This is in that debrief time when the students come back together from their teams, they've done their investigations, and now they're comparing their findings. They're actually having to think about what their peers are presenting and distinguish among fact and opinion or speculation, and give that feedback to each other, and also think critically about their own work. So the role of an educator in this next generation environment is, in a scientific context, is really bringing the next generation science standards to life by facilitating the expectations that a student engage as a scientist or engineer, and then also to sort of link up with these technical areas of ELA. And as we'll see here in a second, just click over, math. So not to take too much time on this, but the math Common Core practices very closely relate and mirror, in some ways, the science and engineering practices. So from a Common Core math perspective, students need to be able to make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. That's what the student is doing in their team when they launch off of that question or that problem to begin actually doing an investigation, planning it out, carrying that investigation out, and then forming a conclusion. Reasoning abstractly and quantitatively in order to plan something requires abstract reasoning. That's why the plan happens first. It's not that students are given materials, they're allowed to sort of play with them. They do something, they observe, and then they write a lab later. That's not science. That's sort of journaling. And it's not reasoning abstractly either. It's actually journaling on something that's very concrete because it has already happened in the past. So we don't want to do that. We want to do it the other way around. We want students to play that real role of scientist and engineer, reason abstractly, form a plan, carry the plan out, and then actually form an argument based on the results. So number 3, constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others. We just sort of talked about that. Modeling with math. Using math to be able to evaluate, analyze, and also the idea of recursive steps. So as a student is creating a plan, ultimately, whether it's engineering in the engineering process or in the scientific process, students are developing some type of a test procedure. And that's actually modeling with math because test procedures require recursive steps. They require precision. They often require capturing data in such a way that you can properly analyze it. So it's a key math Common Core practice that's being brought to life in science now as well. Using appropriate tools strategically. This can be operations. It may also be sort of in the context of which process to actually use. Number 6, attending to precision. Thinking about the specifics as a student is going through the procedure. What are the specific quantities that are needed to be added, in what order? This is all Common Core math practices. Looking for and making use of structure. This is, again, stepwise procedure. Using the logic of a process is key, not only for science but also for the math Common Core. Looking for and expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. When we look at a procedure and we see that, and a common concrete example of this is actually from an ELA process writing perspective. Oftentimes students will be asked to make a procedure for how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And so Students will go home and they'll come back with a 100-step procedure and how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and then, of course, sort of follow that procedure in class, and they don't end up with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Well, when you think about expressing regularity and repeated reasoning, it's taking that 100-step procedure and trying to boil it down to 5 steps, and perhaps of those 5 steps, there are some steps that are repeated over and over again for so many iterations or so many trials. And so this is really where the math practices are bringing up logic, but logic in terms of the practices and processes of NGSS are kind of baked in. And so using logic is necessary in the science classroom, but it's not only bringing sort of the NGSS to life, but it's bringing math Common Core practices to life as well. So that brings us to the new definition of effective STEM instruction. So effective STEM instruction, it now really focuses on that student as the one who is carrying out the investigation and not mirroring something they've already seen. So this is the National Research Council's definition of effective STEM instruction. Effective STEM instruction capitalizes on students' early interests and experiences, identifies and builds on what they know, and provides them with the experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. So when you look at that picture on the left, what you're seeing is students having something maybe pre-taught or modeled for them. It's not engaging them in the practices. They're not developing any models. They're not using precision. They are just observing what their teacher's doing. And you can pretty easily see that the next step would be for them to go take what they've just seen and go do that on their own. The shift here is the teacher's no longer the center. The students are starting with that problem or question and then trying to carry it out. They're trying to use the practice skills they have to get at that content, to then take the content further and see how they can use what they know to test an idea, to test a solution. And so it's engaging them in those practices. And it's also sustaining their interest because this is all new to them. First of all, it's new content, but it's an idea. It's a new idea that they've had. It's theirs. It's very personal. And a proper curriculum is going to have very not only grade-specific sequence, but yearly. So it's grade-specific, so content-specific to first grade, second grade, third grade, but also content that's specific to September, specific to October, November, December, January, and so on. Because what you want to be doing is intentionally nurturing students' curiosity. And so by intentionally articulating curriculum in that way, September through June and first grade through 8th grade, what you're doing is you are sort of creating little lily pads of concepts that connect one to the next so that you can continue to scaffold, build on what the students know, and sustain their interest over time. So it's very, very important to really view that classroom experience from the definition of effective STEM instruction that we have now and really look at this language specifically, especially in terms of engaging the students in the practices. They're at the center, their ideas are at the center. It's not show and tell and do anymore. So that brings us to sort of these readiness levels. So there are different levels of resources and sort of curriculum, whether it's commercially created or it's created by museums or it's created by teachers, whoever creates it. So these readiness levels are sort of kind of broken into 4, and you may have heard of sort of similar language around ELA or reading context. Sort of the lowest level is just awareness. It's students being able to sort of tell you what a scientist or engineer is or does. A trip to the museum creates awareness, but just because you've seen the electronics exhibit does not mean that you are prepared to wire a house or create circuits. You're just aware of what they are and that they exist as a student. Knowledge readiness is, again, kind of like a trip to the museum, but something that textbooks have traditionally been good at. Knowledge readiness sort of teaches students all about what a scientist or what scientists and engineers have discovered, what they've done. So it's really kind of backward looking. So knowledge of science and engineering. Performance readiness is something that you typically get with the traditional sort of FOSS and STC kits or other sort of kits where students learn, oh, if you want to find out how hard a rock is, you perform a specific task. So that task might be to take the rock or mineral and scratch it on a surface that is of known hardness and of different surfaces of known hardness to try and get a sense of, you know, its rock or mineral's hardness. Mastery readiness is really focusing on specific skills, those practice skills and process skills which are transferable. They make students trainable and really empower them to answer any question or problem in an evidence-based way, an evidence-based being data-based way. So mastery readiness sort of looks like solving the problem of which countertop is the most durable. If a student was presented with the idea or the question, or the problem, I guess let's put it this way, a problem of designing a kitchen and using the most durable countertop available, and maybe they're shown different building materials that they could use for that countertop, how is the student, and the student should be able to do this as a result of instruction, you know, take their practice skills and take that problem apart and say, okay, well, if I have these different materials and I need the most durable countertop, how am I going to go about testing the materials to decide which countertop is most durable? And what is durability? Is it how hard it is in terms of being scratched, or is it perhaps how flexible it is so that when things are dropped it doesn't cleave or fracture? Is it something that needs to be able to freeze or be boiled or brought to boiling temperatures? These are all sort of higher order thinking skills that need to be applied to the problem, and then processes and practices are applied to gather data to then come to some database conclusion about which countertop is most durable. That is students at a mastery level. In terms of the classroom itself, thinking about what resources are required. So, and this is a bit where NOADM comes in. The resources that are required first and foremost are well beyond mapping. Mapping is single-digit percentages of the time required in terms of having adequate curriculum. Curriculum is really understanding by design. It's taking those performance expectations, the 3 dimensions that are associated, grouping them, bringing them to life in a context, and doing it in a way that nurtures students' curiosity from 1st grade through 8th or pre-K through 12th grade and September through June, in a way that the students' experience as a user of the curriculum or as a consumer of the curriculum is constantly scaffolding and enhanced and connected so that they get a deep experience and knowledge of the content and the practices and the processes, but also a consistent look or a consistent definition of what science and engineering is and what these terms are that are key and practices are. That requires professional development. It requires teacher background as part of the curriculum. It requires robust assessments and a lot of thoughtful, intentional planning. In terms of professional development, teachers need to be all on the same page. They need to understand the resources they have, but also how to facilitate that inquiry environment so that the standards come to life in a way that the teacher is not showing and then expecting students to do what's been shown, but in a way that the teacher's facilitating this learning environment. To do it hands-on requires materials, and so what you see kind of down in the bottom right corner is materials specific to different units in the curriculum. What you see there is NOADM materials, so probably materials for 2, maybe 3 teachers there on that palette. And all of that should link together to make that classroom STEM learning experience something that's inquiry-based, that it's standards-based, that it's understanding by design, and that it's giving students the opportunity and really requiring them to be scientists and engineers in the classroom. That brings us to sort of this idea of STEAM. So STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, is really just an acronym. And so at some point, if we add art in there, and we could add history, and we could add many other disciplines, we're ultimately really talking about school. And so by teaching students in an environment where they're developing these science and engineering practice skills through the next generation science standards, what we're doing is we're training their higher order thinking skills, their creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills. Those skills are useful in all these other disciplines. In the case of art, so where we start to hear about STEAM more recently, art is not about aesthetics. Aesthetics is an element of art, but art is not about aesthetics. Art is engineered communication. And so oftentimes the talk of STEAM is really window dressing. It's making things beautiful. Real, true art is engineered communication. And what you see on your screen right now is Pablo Picasso's most famous work, Guernica. And Guernica is not particularly beautiful. It's not particularly aesthetically pleasing. Guernica was a work of art that Pablo Picasso created to talk about the atrocities of the fascists in his homeland in Guernica in Spain. And he created it while he lived in exile. And it angered the fascists because it communicated something about who they were, what they were doing, and who they were doing it to. And so Pablo Picasso was able to basically use those same higher order thinking skills, the creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills that are part of those STEM practices that we're teaching students, to look at the problem of fascism and to look at the atrocities and to communicate back very specifically and very clearly to them about what they've done and also to others at that time. And as proof of how effective he was, and that this was really the point and is the point of art and what makes great art, is that when the fascists discovered Guernica, they came to him angry and said, "What did you do?" And his response was, "I didn't do anything, you did it." And so it's very profound that we think of these STEM practice skills and these higher order thinking skills as being something that's cross-disciplinary and something that we use to engineer communication, to engineer solutions, to take apart problems, and to think critically about the world we're a part of. And when I say we, it's teachers, but it's also students, because these are the skills that students need to be developing and applying and demonstrating as a result of instruction, effective STEM instruction. And so when you think about making that bridge to art, that's what you need to be thinking about. And so you're making students better creators and better communicators within art, but also better consumers, because by thinking critically and by employing those skills, they're able to better understand what's being communicated. For instance, like Guernica is really not about aesthetics. It's about atrocities. It's about fascism. It's about common people, where they live. It's about animals. And it's about what humans do to humans and to nature. And so that's very profound, and it's a much deeper way to approach art than purely aesthetics. So it's something to think about. And that brings us basically to data. So what happens when you take these STEM practices and you apply them in the context of your classroom? So we've been testing and developing curriculum for almost 10 years now related to these practice skills. And as the next generation science standards were emerging, and even the National Research Council's publications early on in 2008, 2009, and even a bit before that, we have really been on top of that in incorporating these great ideas in our curriculum because, again, standards are a minimum. They're not intended to constrain curriculum, but to make sure the curriculum meets some basic criteria. And as we apply these in another NECAP state, in the NECAP state of New Hampshire, we saw fourth grade performance, as you see here, happen on a level of like 12 to 30% higher than state average, and multiple double-digit percentages of students who received distinction. And also, I believe it was in 2009, this particular school district went to #1 in the state of New Hampshire. And if you know NEAP scores, New Hampshire is #1 in the country. So you could potentially make the argument that in some ways these practices really were able to promote schools to #1 even in the country. So it's something to think about. When you look at the subtest performance, purple and yellow are the school scores, and the pink and blue are the state scores for different years. And you can see how much higher the school performed over state average in each of the subsections of the NECAPs. So especially looking at inquiry, because again, that's the direction that the next generation science standards are going in. It's really a scientific and engineering focus or refocus of what we've traditionally thought as inquiry. And then really forming inquiry as the inquiry of life science and the inquiry of physical science and earth science and so on, engineering. So again, practices matter. When students are able to be equipped and empowered with the practice skills, they're able to take the question apart, the problem apart, and actually come to conclusions, use the data, and perform the expectations. And that's key. That's what it's all about. Looking at another NECAP state, Vermont, you can see on that previous slide, these guys were 452. They were all proficient, actually. In Vermont, NECAP scores, and this is not using a program, but just sort of taking a look at state averages. Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, basically everybody's proficiency levels at a fourth grade level hover around 50%, somewhere between 45 and 55. You see a dip in 8th grade, and then sometimes you see it kind of pick back up in 11th. And there's a reason in 8th grade, students have been through middle school, especially in larger districts, and we see students drop off, and there's a good amount of research to show that the drill and kill that happens in middle school sometimes, really that focus on lower order thinking skills, just causes students to eliminate STEM as something of an interest as they're sort of beginning to make decisions for themselves, and they're sort of changing developmentally as well. In Massachusetts, when we apply these practices in urban environments, Massachusetts, even under the Massachusetts Common Assessment Program, MCAS, we see districts perform well above state level. This is an example from an urban district in the city of Lynn. Lynn is a city of about 120,000 people. It's a UN High Council on Refugee Relocation point. There's something on the order of 100+ languages spoken in the schools. It's incredibly diverse. Over 70% free and reduced lunch, low income students. And over the course of 2.5 years, we saw this particular school go from 36% advanced and proficient to 87%, which is more than 50% above state average. And you can see the warning and needs improvement really emptying out. In other schools that are really the opposite, where sort of CEOs and executives of all types live in small community suburban environment, Manchester Memorial School, their students are reaching similar levels of achievement as the students in the urban schools and seeing dramatic gains, double-digit gains, very quickly over the course of a year or two. And then you see these sort of plateaus that happen up around 80% proficiency or proficient and advanced combined. And the reason that you see that is that the students, it's really the students thinking at this point. It's all on them to be able to really push the envelope. When you look at scoring and standardized tests, open response questions, things like questions within the inquiry section, tend to carry higher point values. So if a student is off on 1 or 2, it will knock them from 100 to an 80 very quickly. So really at this point, once you hit 80, 85, you're really kind of striving for perfection. And so I guess there's a question of whether you can actually reach 100%, especially on the scale of hundreds to thousands of students in a district. But nonetheless, it gives you a good look that these performance results are not something that's only suburban or urban or rural, but actually something that can be attained across all. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. Again, I'm Francis Vigent, CEO here at NoAtom. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope that you found this webinar beneficial. If you are viewing this offline or you have any questions, we are at the end of the hour, but we'd be happy to take those questions for you offline. Feel free to email them to me, Francis Vigent. My email address is fvigent, V-I-G-E-A-N-T, at nowatom, K-N-O-W-A-T-O-M.com, or you can email them to Marianne DeLacy, mdelacy at nowatom.com, or you can give her a call directly, 617-475-3475, extension 2006. Again, it's been a pleasure meeting with you. If you are interested in taking a look at strategically implementing the next generation science standards, this Friday there's a webinar, July 21st at 10 a.m., and you're welcome to register for free at info.noatom.com/implementing-NGSS-practices-webinar. And if you need some help registering or have any questions about that webinar, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen or myself. And again, thank you for joining us. Have a great day and a great year, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thanks.